AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the Russian Revolution, right? Yes, a revolution of all times to break out during the very first Worldwide War, all right? So, well, not the very first Worldwide War. The very first Worldwide War was like the French and Indian, the 7 Years' War, but we're not getting into that debate right now, all right? So, in the middle of the First World War, all right, in the middle of World War I in 1917, Russia is going to go through a revolution, right? And we're going to pick up right now where we left off in class talking about the split between these two new governments that are going to pop up after Nicholas abdicates, right? Now, a quick little reminder, why did Nicholas abdicate? Because he told them to shoot on the crowd. He literally looked at the military and was like, shoot all those women in the street. And they were like, no, and they refused to do that and joined the mob anyway. And so, if feeling overwhelmed, he abdicated the throne, was soon arrested, and now the Duma was in charge, right? Now, the Duma, the legislative body that was actually established after the 1905 failed revolution, is going to be led by a man named Alexander Kerensky and is known as the Provisional Government. And then you got this other thing, though, called the Petrograd Soviet, right? And the Petrograd Soviet, the Petrograd Soviet is what we would consider a shadow government, right? And there's going to be a massive feud between this very real government, known as the Provisional Government, and this very not real government, known as the Petrograd Soviet, right? Basically, what was going to end up happening is the Petrograd Soviet was not a legitimate government in the sense that you think of legitimate governments, right? They were non-elected officials. They were forming what was known as a Soviet and stuff like that, which we're about to talk about that right now. But what you had to understand is that their entire goal right now is to weaken, dismantle, and disrupt the peace that the Provisional Government is going to try and bring pre-revolution, right? But this is all going down, of course, during the February Revolution that happened in March. Welcome to European history. Now, the Provisional Government, though, chose to stay in the war, which is going to anger a bunch of workers, right? A lot of the workers and a lot of the soldiers feel that the war is lost, right? The Russians are like, we are getting waxed, all right? We are getting our butts beaten off right now. It's too cold to even dig trenches. We got people deserting the war in massive droves and stuff like that. So please let us just get out of this, right? And the Provisional Government was like, no, let's stay in it because we think we can win. All right, so now these angry groups of workers and soldiers, though, that were mad that the war was still going on, are going to form groups known as Soviets, right? And that's what a Soviet is, all right? It's a group of workers and soldiers, all right? Or basically, think of it actually, and if you really want to look at it, think of a labor union for all working class people, right? And so these Soviets keep getting together and trying to decide how are they going to dismantle the government? How are they going to continue the direction of the revolution? How are they going to continue the ideas and the ideals that they want? Well, the Petrograd Soviet, that is going to be the large entity that is going to be, based in St. Petersburg, is going to seek to use tactics to undermine the Provisional Government. I got PG right there. That's Provisional Government, right? For example, Army Order Number 1, right? Army Order Number 1 is something that the Petrograd Soviet puts out there, basically telling all soldiers, hey, you didn't elect or vote for those officers. Those are just Russian aristocrats and oligarchs, right? Those are people that have come from very wealthy families, and they don't know you, and they don't understand your plight, so you should just not listen to them. So like now, the Army Order Number 1, that thing that the Petrograd Soviet puts out there, is basically an attempt to try and weaken the infrastructure of the military to make it so the Russians can't even keep fighting anymore, right? And it also told these people that if you want to desert, go ahead and desert. So you've got basically what flirts with the relevancy of a rumor running around the military, really dismantling it from the inside and weakening it, right? Now, then you're going to see the entrance of a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin. He shows up in April of 1917. This guy is one of the most important figures in all of history that we will talk about, right? He is one of the most important figures due to the reverberations and the effects that he will cause, all right? Well, who he is he was a man that was living in Switzerland at the time, and he is a Russian-born person. So now he is a Russian in and of himself. He speaks Russian, knows Russian, but he had been banished to Switzerland and out of Russia due to the actions of his brother and himself because he showed communist ideology and also extreme socialist ideology, and he heavily protested against the government. It will end up resulting in his banishment, and he will be asked to leave Russia for forever. But interesting little factoid here, the Germans snuck him in. All right, so the Germans legitimately snuck Vladimir Lenin back into Russia, put him on a train, got him all the way through the German frontier, and all the way past the front lines and back into Russia, right? Now, why would they do this? Because they know of the pull that this man has, right? They know that his writings are very well read and very well circulated. And he also shows up with two assistants, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And these three men create basically one of the most intense, violent, communist, ideological groups you could ever imagine, right? So his assistants are known as Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, right? And we will talk a lot about Joseph Stalin a little bit later on, all right? So the thing about, oh, by the way, this is Joseph Stalin when he was young, and everybody thinks he looks like that one of those guys from One Direction. I always put it in there because I teach at an all-girls school, and, gotta, give a guy his due. So going into it, though, you have to understand also their followers were known as Bolsheviks, right? Now, the Petrograd Soviet basically had two different kinds of ideologies inside of it. And also the Duma itself, had a very large group known as the Social Democratic Party, right? That was an extremely socialist party. And so they had two feuding ideologies within inside of it, okay? And those two were known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, right? The Mensheviks favored government ways of doing things. Remember the Girondins from France during the French Revolution? They're much more like that. They think that there's a passive and peaceful way to bring about an end to this revolution and to get us out, or to get the Russians out of the war. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, by the way, Bolshevik means majority and Menshevik means minority, was the bigger group inside of the Petrograd Soviet and also inside of the Social Democratic Party in Russia at the time. And so what you have to understand is the Bolsheviks were the majority, right? And they favored violent uprising, right? Violent uprising, topple the old government, destroy it, and give it to the people and start a true communist regime, right? And just to give you a heads up, this next phase of the revolution is also known as the Bolshevik Revolution, so you can see who won. Now, going into it, the Bolsheviks, though, were also heavily communist and favored that violent action, all right? So keep that in the back of your mind. So what that is eventually going to lead to is this thing known as the October Revolution, right? Yes, that is right. Two revolutions in 1 year, both in Russia, both making major changes, right? The October Revolution, which actually occurred in November, is going to start on the heels of these things known as the April Theses, right? So after Vladimir Lenin arrived back in Russia, he started publishing this really, really intense document, a pamphlet you could call it, or a periodical, if you will, the April Theses. And inside of it, he demanded three key things, right? He said that he thought that Russians should seek peace, land, and bread, basically saying we need to get out of this war, we need to redistribute the land that is in Russia away from all these rich Russians that are the small group and give it to the people of Russia, and also bread. Bread, and it's important. And then another big aspect of it is worker control of the means of production, a heavily communist ideology, right? Giving the control of the means of production to the people in a state-controlled government. And last but not least, power to the Soviets, right? Basically saying that the Soviets are workers and soldiers. They represent what Russia truly is. They should be the ones in power. And so at massive speeches where he garnered a crap load of attention, Vladimir Lenin will get the steam rolling on this next October Revolution. And in October, the Bolsheviks, underneath his leadership and his guy, Leon Trotsky is actually going to be the leader of the Red Army as well. They are going to storm into the major government buildings in Petrograd and then also establish key footholds in Moscow as well and establish a new rulership. And they do it pretty quickly and easily, right? So they actually just go in, overthrow the government, very Napoleon-esque of 1799, very coup d'etat, if you will. They roll in and completely overhaul the government and wreck it, all right? They actually also had elections at one point, but then they said that they weren't real because they didn't get as many people elected, but still. But this basically is a scene from that entire moment, right? Of them rushing into the St. Petersburg, ruling classes and into the Winter Palace and overthrowing the government and establishing themselves as the new ruler, the Bolshevik rulers, the communist regime of Russia, right? And the new government, the Communist Party, under Lenin called for an immediate end to World War I. And they got what they wanted, right? They pulled out of the war almost immediately, right? So very, very quickly, before the year was even over, by 1917, they signed what is known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right? And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that gets validated and then actually verified by March of 1918 gives a metric buttload of land to the Germans, right? The Germans actually got a lot of land that Russia ceded to them, right? Because literally, look at all this stuff. All the Finland area, all this stuff which is now modern-day Poland and Belarus went to the Germans because the Russians were like, take what you want at this point, we do not care, and they just sent it to them, right? Because they just wanted out of the war as fast as possible, right? And so because that was one of the key things that Vladimir Lenin said, is peace, land, bread. The big part of it, of course, being peace, right? And also, in the back of Vladimir Lenin's mind, he was just like, well, communism will take over the entire world and Soviet influence will spread throughout the world, so we'll get that land back eventually, so we really don't care. And so, yeah, but he was willing to give up that huge chunk of land at first, right? Now, what's going to happen, though, is do you think that everybody was just like, yeah, Vlad, I think it's a great idea to give up all of this land in Russia to all these people and Germans. Probably not. All right, so yeah, which is going to result in what's known as the Russian Civil War. All right, and the Russian Civil War will be going on from 1917 to 1923, right? Something that some of you probably haven't heard about before. But yes, there was a massive civil war that actually happened going all the way from the end of World War I into the Roaring 20s, because the 20s were not so roaring for the Russians, right? And it was going to be between two different rival armies, because a civil war, of course, is a war inside of a nation. It is between what is known as the Reds and the Whites, right? Now, the Reds are the communists and the Vladimir Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, all those guys together, leading their armies from very key defensive locations in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, right? Now, the Reds have a massive advantage out the gate, because the main reason is they are fighting what's called a defensive war, right? They are defending their locations, right? Keeping someone out is a heck of a lot easier than getting in, okay? And so the Reds are literally, who hold Moscow and St. Petersburg, are just repelling white attacks the whole time, right? Speaking of, who are the Whites, though, Mr. Terry? That's a great question, Brianna Bourne. The Whites are a group of monarchists, liberals, basically capitalists in general. All the people who favored the old way of the provisional government and Nicholas II and all those guys, those are your Whites, right? Oh, also, fun fact, some English people and Americans as well. That's right, we actually sent money, funds, some troops to help fight this war as well on the side of the White Army, all right? Now, going into it, this is also one of my favorite, this used to be my phone background back in the day. It's one of my favorite pieces of propaganda. It is literally something, it's a propaganda poster from the Russian Civil War. You see the White Knight right here with the Russian flag behind his back trying to slay the Red Dragon, which has taken control of Moscow and key locations. It's so cool. But the thing is that's not how the war went, all right? Because the Whites consisted, yes, of monarchs and liberals and conservatives and the Allies and stuff, but the Red Army under Trotsky defended Petrograd, now which later is going to be called Leningrad. I'm so sorry. It's like that. They change it all the time. And Moscow, and they end up beating the Whites. Also because Trotsky trains a very disciplined army, right? Because these people are fighting for a cause and a new initiative that they have been preached to about this entire time. And so they are able to beat the Whites, and they do this by being relentless and also a lot more violent. And it was during this time, Kylie Burke, that your people, the Romanovs, were all shot in a basement in Siberia. But we'll talk about that in class, okay? It's a good story. So now, and I know Kylie Burke's probably amped for class now tomorrow, because everybody loves talking about the Romanovs and Anastasia and stuff like that, and, rah-rah Rasputin, et cetera, et cetera. So going into it, though, the Red Army does end up winning by 1923. And so something that you have to understand, though, is that when this all happens, Vladimir Lenin does have to usher in one key little thing. Now, this feels probably weird because the College Board wants me to just shove this random thought process into you as hard as I can, but you have to understand one thing here, all right? After winning the Russian Civil War, you would think that Vladimir Lenin would go full-blown communism, right? But he can't, because it's not like he doesn't live in a communistic world yet. He is living in a very capitalist world. So he must come up with an economic system to keep the new Soviet Union by 1923 viable and economically sustainable, right? And what he's going to do is he uses a system called the New Economic Policy, known as the NEP, where basically he allows a limited amount of capitalism with private enterprise and small-scale trade. If some farmers want to grow some vegetables and sell them at a farmer's market, they're allowed to do that. But all large corporations and large-scale industry and massive farming that's meant to feed the masses is going to be state-owned and regulated, right? So basically he created a hybrid system of farming like capitalism and communism merged together in his new NEP, because he wanted to lead to economic recovery. But also the thing you have to understand is did it do that? Yes, it did lead to some economic recovery, but it also increased inequality and ideological tensions within the Communist Party, right? Because some people like Trotsky are going to look at this NEP and be like, yeah, Vlad, we love you, Lenin. Great idea. And then some people like Stalin are going to be like, we could be even more communist. And he actually wasn't even really as much of a communist as he was just a despot and a friggin' nutbag. But anyway, we'll get to him a little bit later on. And so the new Soviet Union would start off its entire government with this new economic policy, also known as the NEP, right? But now one other thing we have to kind of go over real quick is just the end to World War I in general, right? So basically, you're in the final phases of World War I at this point, okay? Because remember, it ends in 1918, and the Russians just got done with a massive civil war and a revolution in 1917. So we have the end on the horizon, right? And so what you have to understand is in the final phases of the war, by 1917, when Russia's going through their revolution and all that other stuff is happening, a lot of crazy stuff is going on the Western Front in the war, right? Because the Eastern Front is all but gone, right? And because literally the Russians are like, I'm out. And they leave, okay? So by 1917, though, you got northern France, which is absolutely destroyed and in absolute rubble, and the Western Front is just ravaging not only people, but villages and farmers and all this other stuff. You also have the fact that Russia has dipped, and they're gone completely, and they're now out of the war. Austria-Hungary is falling all apart and beginning to dissolve and losing territory. You also have Britain, who's almost bankrupt, and at one point was about to start like smelting down pots and pans to make more bullets because they were running out of stuff to fight this war with. The effects of the war of attrition have really begun to set in by this point. The Germans are also heavily revolting, right? The Germans are revolting against their government. I was there. I was on this boat right here. As you know, this is the Kiel Mutiny. A very large boat of German men decided that they just refused to go out into the like war efforts anymore. They were like, no. Like they were like, hey, get on the boat and go fight. And then they were all like, no, like we lost, bro. Like it's okay. We just got to figure it out from here. These right here are people in Berlin, right in the streets of Berlin, the capital of Germany, that have taken to the streets again and have built barricades out of old newspapers and stuff, which apparently are really good bullet defenses, all right? And they're shooting back at military people that are trying to make them stop, but they're like, look, in this war, my kids are hungry, we're gonna die, we have lost, just call it a day, all right? So that's when the Germans decided to try and throw a Hail Mary, right? Yes, for those of you who don't know what a Hail Mary is when you throw a really long pass to the end zone, hoping and praying someone catches it. And it is known as the Zimmerman telegram, right? Now, the thing was that everybody in the world knew that it was a matter of time until the Americans got involved, right? Just a matter of time, okay? And so the Germans apparently sent a telegram, a secret one, from them to Mexico, trying to encourage Mexico to invade the United States. Because the Germans had a plan to go on a massive offensive and try to end the war really, really quickly, because they knew that Britain and France were struggling too, right? And so this telegram said, hey, Mexico, we will give you a bunch of money and tanks and guns and all kinds of other stuff to invade the United States, and we'll give you back the old territory that used to belong to you, right? Because mainly they wanted to keep the United States distracted and out of the war, right? But what happens is that the secret telegram gets intercepted by the British, sent to the United States, and then gets published in newspapers all over the United States, causing the United States to enter the war in 1917 to massive amounts of army enlistment. We're like, oh, heck no, the Germans are not going to try and tell those people to invade us. And so the huge army gets recruited immediately after that. And by April, you've got massive American forces inside of Europe. Germany tries to attempt to end the war by staging a huge offensive in the summer of 1917, but it fails miserably. But it is going to give us this thing called stormtroopers. We'll talk about that in class, though. But American forces will eventually overwhelm them. They stopped the massive German offensive. They got so close to taking Paris. It was crazy. But the American forces do show up by April and completely overwhelm the Germans. Wilhelm II is going to abdicate. He runs away to the Netherlands. So funny. He just like runs over there like this and just I need to stop doing the dead arm thing. And so like now the Weimar Republic will be installed because Germany is just like, maybe we don't need a Kaiser anymore. By the way, really quickly, next to the Weimar Republic being installed, just go ahead and slap a really weak and ineffective next to that, because that is going to be the government that Hitler topples. And Germany will surrender on 11/11/14, that's wrong. 11/11/1918, all right? 11/11/1918, all right? Make a wish. Now, going into it, though, they end up surrendering on November the 11th, 1918. And immediately after that, when a war ends that has been this scale and this magnitude, you got to figure out a way to bring peace and like tranquility to it after that. And so they hold this thing called the Paris Peace Conference, right? Now, at that Paris Peace Conference, a lot of them are trying to have this big argument of who is to blame for this, right? Well, there's an ideological split involved with this, all right? Now, this line should be like over here, okay? Because that right there is Georges Clemenceau. He's the leader of France. He actually was on this side of the line. So the red line should honestly be like, yeah, like right there. Because Wilson, or Woodrow Wilson right there, was an idealist. And he thought we shouldn't blame anybody. It was a worldwide war. We shouldn't blame anybody. So he came up with a document known as the 14 Points. His document to try and bring an end to this entire war was a simple document that established blame of no particular party. And it laid out 14 rules that would prevent future war. Okay? Like, for example, free trade over the seas, adequate, like, guarantees given and taken to national, like blah, blah, blah. Like, so, like, all kinds of, the people of Austria-Hungary, they need to start splitting up and create new states, etc., etc. It also, though, called for this thing known as a League of Nations, right? It basically was requesting all the powers at be in the world at the time to create a massive peacekeeping organization, right? what you know of as the modern day United Nations, right? It was basically like, hey, let's establish a League of Nations so we can debate and talk and discuss and avoid a giant war like this ever happening ever again, right? Seems simple enough, right? But the Europeans are like, no, we don't like that because we're really upset at one person, all right? And who they were upset with? Germany. Yeah, and they wanted to go with this other document called the Treaty of Versailles, right? And that document was favored by the Europeans because it included the following things. One, a war guilt clause that Germany was forced to sign, right? Like, so the Germans were forced to sign a clause in the agreement saying that it was our fault the war happened, which is egregious because if you really look at it, a lot of this had to do with like Austria and Serbia and other powers involved as well. They also blamed Germany for the destruction that was caused, and they said that they owed reparations in the neighborhood of $33 billion in 1918 money, which added up to $2.7 trillion in modern day money. All right. So it said that Germany had to give up all of its colonies and de-imperialize. It also said that they had to demilitarize, having a non-existent navy and air force and a much smaller military. Right. They also had to get rid of all their U-boats and all this other stuff. Of course they did because, now, but another big thing about it, though, that you need to understand is they had to create Poland as a buffer state, all right? They wanted to create a new, country called Poland, okay? Bringing Poland back. Yay, Poland. Bring it back, okay, from the depths and ashes of history to create basically a buffer state between the Russians and then also the Germans. And then also what you have to understand, last but not least, they were supposed to demilitarize the Rhineland. I will explain that in class, okay, because it's a little bit of a deep concept, all right? Now, the Weimar Republic, though, is going to be brought in, and out the gate it is severely weakened. Now, Wilson felt that this treaty would lead directly to another war, and he refused to ratify it, all right? And the Americans never ratified the actual League of Versailles, or it's not the League of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles. And also, the League of Nations was created, but the U.S. never joined, nor did the Soviet Union, and Germany wasn't allowed in, so it wasn't very much of a league, right? Maps were going to be redrawn, the creation of Poland and Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia is going to be very important. Alsace-Lorraine goes back to the French. And also, you're going to see the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary. But we'll talk about all that stuff in class, and we're going to get real roaring and real depressed starting next class.